Hello everybody and welcome to Ukraine the Possible, the podcast with a social justice perspective, a view from inside a nation resisting imperialist invasion, a voice in search of solidarity. Today, we're going deep underground in Ukraine, not literally, but into a deal that was quickly lost in the noise of frontline news and high-stakes diplomacy. This deal could very well define Ukraine's destiny for decades to come. We're talking about an agreement ratified in May 2025 between Ukraine and the United States, quickly nicknamed the Subsurface Resources Agreement by the media. Our goal today is to bring this deal into the light, to understand what it means for Ukraine's future, and to examine the price of a partnership with America, especially in its current, very specific political landscape. So, what exactly is in this agreement? On May 8, 2025, Ukraine's parliament ratified the document, and President Zelensky signed it into law just a few days later. On the surface, the deal looks like a partnership. Ukraine agrees to put 50% of the revenue from all new licenses for its natural resources into a joint investment fund with the US. This also includes revenue from so-called dormant licenses, a specific category for deposits where there's been almost no extraction for over a decade. And the list of resources covered is staggering. It includes nearly every mineral that matters for the modern economy: lithium for batteries, titanium for aerospace, graphite, uranium for nuclear power, as well as oil and natural gas. In total, 57 different types of resources, with the option to add more later. In a world shifting towards green energy and new technologies, these are incredibly valuable assets. In return, the United States makes a strikingly modest initial contribution of about $25 million to get the fund started. But here is the most critical part. The agreement creates a mechanism where the value of future US military aid, the very aid Ukraine desperately needs to survive on the battlefield right now, can be converted into shares in this fund, and it seems these will be preferred shares, giving the American side priority when it comes to distributing future profits. Taras Kachka, Ukraine's deputy prime minister and a key negotiator, called this an additional incentive for the US to continue providing aid. The unspoken message is clear: here is your economic stake in our future, therefore help us survive now. To really understand this deal, we have to look at its chaotic backstory. The initial demands from Donald Trump were, to put it mildly, jaw-dropping. He insisted that Ukraine acknowledge a non-existent debt of $300 to $350 billion for past US aid, claiming this resource deal should compensate for those expenses. This was pure extortion, an open attempt to capitalize on a country's desperation during wartime. Many observers compared this rhetoric to colonial exploitation, especially since Trump ignored the fact that much of the aid under the Biden administration had been non-repayable grants. Ukraine's own estimates, backed by institutions like the Kyiv Institute, put the total figure for all aid at a much lower $90 to $127 billion. The situation became even more surreal when the Zelensky administration itself floated the idea of trillion-dollar rare earth resources in its Victory Plan, published in the fall of 2024. In that plan, Ukraine proposed a special agreement for the joint protection and investment in these critical resources. It seems the Ukrainian leadership, under immense pressure, decided to speak the language they thought a new American administration would understand, the language of massive, profitable deals. However, this gamble resulted in a direct demand for payment leveraging Ukraine's vulnerability at the most critical moment of the war. It's also crucial to remember the political climate in which these negotiations were happening. The Trump administration had already created deep uncertainty about military aid. New large-scale packages, like those under President Biden, were no longer being approved. Trump repeatedly said his focus was on making a deal with Russia, not on military support, and he consistently pushed to turn all aid into loans. This means the central premise of the deal, that it would act as an incentive for American assistance, was already crumbling. The incentive was no longer what it was, but the price for Ukraine remained. The way this deal was passed raises its own serious questions. The Verkhovna Rada voted with a stunning 338 votes in favor. Not a single vote against, not a single abstention. In a parliament known for lively, often contentious debate, such unanimity is almost unheard of. The whole process was rushed through with incredible speed to meet an American political deadline. Taras Kachka, the negotiator, even admitted this. The agreement was signed on May 1, 2025 and ratified on May 8th. A day the Trump administration had reportedly designated as US victory in World War II Day. This kind of haste, tied to external political dates and combined with absolute unanimity, inevitably drew comparisons to Soviet political theater, where appearances and loyalty were more important than substance and debate. And what was the substance that was ignored? The main issue is a fundamental lack of transparency. The parliament members were only shown the framework agreement, but the crucial details, how the fund will actually be managed, how profits will be distributed, how projects will be chosen, are all in separate technical agreements. These documents were never ratified by Parliament and are not public. Essentially, the deputies voted for a pig in a poke. Or, to put it another way, they voted for the cover of a book without being allowed to read the most important chapters. This directly undermines democratic oversight. According to leaks in the Ukrainian press, these hidden terms may give the American side a majority on the fund's governing committees and could even allow for Ukraine's voting rights to be stripped if it violates the terms. So let's look at what we do know about the terms, and they are revealing. The fund gets the right of first refusal on investments in all new and dormant licenses. This means any promising new mining opportunity has to be offered to the joint US-Ukraine fund first. Even if the fund says no, the license holder can't offer a better deal to anyone else. Furthermore, the US International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, gets the priority right to buy the raw materials that are extracted at market terms for the entire life of the license. If the DFC declines, the seller can't offer more favorable terms to another buyer for 6 months. Let's be clear, this isn't just about sharing profits. It's about the US gaining priority access to the physical resources themselves and significant control over their flow. It effectively limits Ukraine's sovereign right to choose its own investors and sell its own resources on the best markets for decades to come. The agreement is also perpetual. Its obligations are effectively forever. Ukraine gives up the right to change investment conditions for the fund, and any disputes will be settled in international arbitration, not in Ukrainian courts, further removing the process from public and state oversight. So what does Ukraine actually get out of this? What's the balance sheet of gains and losses? The potential gains are highly conditional. Ukraine might receive investments through the fund which are vital for reconstruction. However, experts from the Financial Times, and even Taras Kachka himself, admit that real economic returns are at least 10 to 15 years away. These are not quick funds for emergency recovery. This is a very long-term and risky pledge. Then there's the incentive for military aid, which, as we've seen, looks weak and uncertain. The losses, however, are far more serious and long-term. Ukraine is losing a significant degree of sovereignty over its future strategic resources. It's losing 50% of potential future revenues from its most valuable new deposits, which will go to the fund instead of the state budget. The deal's opacity creates massive risks for corruption, and the mechanism converting military aid into preferred US shares cements a long-term economic dependence. All of this raises the risk of the resource curse, the trap where a country remains a simple supplier of raw materials, failing to develop its own advanced industries, while foreign capital reaps the rewards. But what about the security guarantees Trump was fond of talking about? The idea that no one will attack as long as America is there. This is, frankly, cynical rhetoric. The agreement contains no language about mutual defense or military commitments. The presence of American companies in Ukraine, and there were 14 with resource permits even before this deal, did not stop the annexation of Crimea in 2014 or the full-scale invasion in 2022. Just this August, a Russian missile strike on a large American electronics factory in western Ukraine proved the point again. Business interests are not a military shield. Real security comes from reliable arms supplies, strong alliances, and sanctions against the aggressor, not from a stake in profits from mining operations decades in the future. This deal didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a much larger and often tragic story. Ukraine has a long history of its wealth being exploited. First by Tsarist Russia, then the Soviet Union. After independence, oligarchs often funneled resource revenues into private pockets instead of the nation's budget. Today, there is a global race for critical minerals, often masked by the language of a green transition. We've seen it in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where deals risk fueling conflict, and in Bolivia, where efforts to nationalize lithium were followed by a coup. Elon Musk's reported reaction, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it," perfectly captures this cynical logic. Meanwhile, Russia is actively seizing Ukrainian mineral deposits in occupied territories as part of its own economic strategy. Even within Ukraine, recent deregulation laws have weakened environmental protections and removed the requirement for approval from local communities for mining projects, creating huge potential for corruption. So, where does this leave us? In a brutal war of attrition, Ukraine is being forced to make impossible choices under extreme pressure. The heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people requires immense sacrifice and constant outside help. This agreement, with its long-term risk of economic dependence, is the forced price the country is paying for salvation from military defeat. But the price is very high. The deal's perpetual nature, its secrecy, the transfer of control over future assets for deferred benefits, and the linking of military aid to mineral profits, it's a profound compromise. And that is the tragic paradox of this war. While fighting fiercely for freedom and sovereignty on the battlefield, the nation is compelled to make concessions that could limit that very sovereignty in the economic sphere for generations, effectively handing over the keys to its own subterranean riches. This podcast relies on credible sources, which are detailed in the description. For further reference, you can access the materials through the provided links.